Thank you, Russ. Actually, I remember that night because I was called up in the middle of the night, and I went over to my sister's house, and I probably need to pull this closer. And I saw my sister in labor as they were getting ready to leave, and I think that's why I don't have any kids. And you may want your phone, Russ.
Oh, yeah, probably. Thank you.
It is great to be with you, and as Russ said, I've been doing this presentation probably for about 20 plus years. I've done it, as far west as Oregon and as far east as Virginia, and finally got to do it in Oklahoma. Took a while there, and I've actually done it here in Texas and Arlington at one point. So I start the presentation just letting folks know a little bit about why I do this. I met my first openly gay person when I went to Bright Divinity School. And I remember meeting him and finding out he was gay and just kept on going. Nothing caused me to stumble. Somehow I got out of my youth and teen years never hearing that homosexuality was a problem. I don't know how I did that, but I'm lucky I did. So at that point, I was like, okay, this is great. Then I found out that he was not going to be able to get ordained in his home region because he was gay. And I, as a heterosexual Anglo woman married to a minister, had no problem getting ordained, and it was a real heartbreaker for me because if there was ever someone truly called to ministry, it was this person. And so from then on, I kind of told myself that I was an ally, a great ally. And then I learned that I was a silent ally, which actually is not an ally at all. When I was teaching at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky, the city council one year was debating a fairness amendment to prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and on through that list. And I never got involved politically, but thankfully the city council meeting was on TV. And I sat there watching as person after person came up, identifying themselves as Christian, and telling the board or the council that if you pass this amendment, you better remember what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. After about the fifth one, I got up, went into our office, and typed up a letter to the editor, my very first one ever. And the Herald Leader at that point allowed me to submit it online. If it had not been an option, it probably would have never gone anywhere because I would have had to find an envelope and find a stamp and do those other things. So I hit send and thought, nobody will publish my letter. Then Michael and I went out to California for a youth event. And when I came back to Lexington, I was checking my voicemail at the office. And the first one came up and said, "How dare you call yourself a Christian?" And the next one came up, "You are of the devil." Just on and on, like, what the? I don't know what happened. And then about 6 or 7 messages in, the registrar from the seminary, who was now retired, said, "Lisa, thank you for your letter." And I was like, And so I went online and saw that it was published, and then there were a lot of responses. And at that point, the seminary, Lexington, had this Saturday morning lay school that met 3 Saturdays in a row from like 8 to noon. And they said, "Why don't you do a class on Sodom and Gomorrah?" Because in my letter, I pointed out that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is really about inhospitality. And if we don't pass the Fairness Amendment, then we better worry about being like Sodom and Gomorrah. So I did that class the first morning. 50 people showed up at 8 o'clock on a Saturday. I don't think it was football season, or maybe the game was later in the day. And I thought to myself, I'm going to convert the masses. I was so excited. So I asked everyone as they were comfortable to go around the room and introduce themselves, and if they would, share what interested them in taking this class. And almost every single person who introduced themselves identified as part of the LGBTQIA plus community. And they came because they wanted to hear something else. And at that moment, I took my disappointment at not converting the masses and realized that these people had had the Bible used as a weapon, and I had the opportunity to let them know some good news. And that began my doing these presentations and my understanding that I can't be an ally and remain silent. So I do these wherever I'm invited. I've done them in congregations. I did one on a military base not too long ago. That was interesting. And then I did one for like the Equality Center in Tulsa. So I've given them in lots of locations. I always say to folks, I don't think it's as necessary here, but I'm not trying to convince someone what they have to think about LGBTQIA as an issue, which is this ridiculous way of putting it. But what I do want to say is you can't discriminate and use the Bible as your weapon, because it won't work. So today I'm going to go through what are commonly known as the clobber passages and give you some insight into how I have interpreted these and what I think they can teach us or not teach us about the issues of gender and sexuality. To start off, though, I always like folks to kind of get a sense of how I approach the Bible, so you know a little bit about me. So whenever I ask folks, what is the Bible? You can imagine, actually, let me just ask, what is the Bible? One word, 2 words. Word, what? Love. Library. Book. All right, those are good answers. Yeah. Understanding, very good, or wisdom, one might say. I often will say what the Bible is not first. The Bible is not what one might call an objective history. Now, we know that there is no such thing as objective history because every history is written by someone who determines what to include and how to interpret those events. I grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line. If I check out 2 books from the library on the Civil War, one written from the north and one written from the south, you'd think I was reading about 2 different wars. So history is not purely objective, but Israel, I don't think, ever set out to write a purely objective history of Israel. It's also not a science textbook. Unfortunately, lots of people go to it for their science, at least when it fits them. They may not want their doctor to practice medicine based on what the Bible might say or not say. One of my favorite experiences is when someone came up to me and said, "What does the Bible say about stem cell research?" And I said, absolutely nothing. I didn't even know what a cell was. So it's not a science textbook, and when we go looking for scientific answers, we're really asking the Bible to do something it was never intended to do. Now, defining something by what it's not is not the best approach, so let's look at what the Bible is or could be seen as being. It's a story of people who claim a common heritage, a common God, hopes, and dreams. It is a theology book, but it's not systematic. Depending on where you look, you'll find different answers to deep theological questions. I see it as a roadmap that was left for us by previous generations of the faith so that we will know we're not the first people to ask hard questions. And we're not the first people to wonder why we're here. And I think it is left behind for us to learn from their mistakes as well as learning what they got right. It also can function as a mirror to help us see ourselves in the story. Now, the problem is we often want to find ourselves in the story as the one who's hero or the one that Jesus is standing up for. I think sometimes we need to try again. In teaching the Hebrew Bible, when I teach the Exodus story, I remind students that most of us, just by being in a higher education institution, are not the slaves in the story. At best, we're Egyptian citizens who benefit from slave labor, and at worst, we're the Pharaoh. So finding that mirror can also help us see our mistakes and what we got wrong and how we might fix it. As someone mentioned, it is like a library. It's a compilation of voices that spans centuries, millennia, and across multiple cultures. But we also need to remember that not all voices were included, so we need to look and listen for what is not being said and whose voice is silenced. And the Bible is a dangerous book. Your first Hebrew lesson for today, I can't help it, I always have to say something about the language of Hebrew. When the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans around 70 CE, some of the Jewish leaders got together at a place called Yavne back then, and they were trying to figure out what to do now that the temple was destroyed and their community might be falling apart. And so they talked about what books would be included in their canon. It wasn't a council, okay? They never took a vote like we think of the Nicene Council or others. But rather, they debated on what might be included. And the test, they said, was whether or not the book or the scroll made the hands unclean. Now, in our culture, if it makes the hands unclean, we would think it's profane and should be left out. But it's just the opposite. The word there is tameh. Tameh is a Hebrew word that means like an altered state. So when you read through some of those laws that talk about unclean and clean, they're really using this word, and we've really messed up in our interpretation. Everyone walks around in their mind as being in a state of tahor or tahara, and some things we encounter in life alter us. And we transition into this altered state, I say like an extraordinary or perhaps a divine sacred state called tameh. The things that do this are things like death, birth, menstrual cycles, all those things that are about the liminality of life. And we all know that those kinds of things change you. If you've given birth, I never have, but I know it changes you. If you've been with someone when they passed, it alters you. And so the rabbis said, if the book makes the hands tameh, it has the power to alter you and should be kept as sacred. And I like to remember that, this book can be used to deal death, or it can be used to give life. And we who interpret it and teach it have that choice every time we speak. Also, just a little thing I will remind folks of. Sometimes I ask people who wrote the Bible, and there are people who would give me 3 answers, usually along a spectrum. There are those who, somewhat like my mother, before she passed, would tell you God wrote the Bible. It fell from heaven in the King James English. There are some who are not necessarily attached to a religion that utilizes the Bible, and so they'll tell you humans wrote it, just a purely human document. There was this one scholar, his name was Tommy Thompson, who said the whole Hebrew Bible was written at the mandate of the Persian government to give the people living in the Cisjordan region under Persian authority a common story to unite them. Most of us, I think, have the third answer, both God and humans. Now, that's really not trying to ride the fence. Rather, I think about the way the Bible came to be as a divine human dance. And sometimes we let the divine lead. And we get wonderful texts like, love is patient and kind. But all too often, I think sometimes the human took the lead in the dance and maybe even asked the divine to sit on the sidelines. And we get texts like, go and kill all the Canaanites, or let women keep silent in the churches. But that's another interpretive act. So when we're reading the Bible and we answer this question, it asks us to think about the authority of Scripture and to recognize that authority must be granted or recognized. It's not automatic. And even when we grant authority to the Bible, what kind of authority? How much authority? Does it make our decisions for us? Well, some people might claim that. I would debate it. And do we have a canon within a canon? That is, are there certain books that are more authoritative for us? I think for too many Christians, Paul's writings are their canon, and the Gospels are the extra biblical material. Not that there's anything wrong with Paul, but we do seek to follow Jesus. And so when we talk about the authority of Scripture, we also talk about the role of our intellect, the role of tradition, the role of our experience. And if we grant the Bible some authority, we read it, we study it, and we listen. But when we go out in the public square and people appeal to the Bible, we have to recognize that not everybody's going to give the Bible any authority. So I think that's not our best option when we're in the public square. Now, those who would say the Bible is their primary, only authority will often say that they are literalists. And some of us may be literalists, know someone we love who is a literalist, or once upon a time were literalists. These are the folks that, as I said, the Bible is their primary or only authority. They like to claim that they don't interpret the Bible, they just read it. Kind of funny idea. They see the biblical mandates as absolutes, at least some of them. And they often will say, the Bible says it, I believe it. That's it. Well, let me tell you a story about my encounter with one literalist. I was with the group Soul Force that was started by Mel White to work for inclusion of LGBTQIA plus folks in the churches. And we were doing a silent prayer vigil at a local Baptist church in Lexington. And I learned first that I'm not good at a silent prayer vigil. Just won't last for me. So this woman walked up and she was, doing all this stuff and flopping her Bible. They always have the floppy Bibles. And saying terrible things to my friend who identified as lesbian. And so I stepped in front of her and, okay, do you say you take the whole Bible literally? Yes, I do. Every single word, I take it literally. I said, okay, well, let me just ask one question. When Jesus said, go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor, it doesn't look like you've done that. And I tell you, I can't make this up. She looked at me and said, he didn't mean it literally. So the truth is, most of us are selectivists. This is a word that I heard Peter Gomes use, who's now deceased, but he was the chaplain at Harvard. And so we select what we think has some authority and what we think is perhaps too dated, too out of touch with the 21st century to hold authority over our lives. And what I say is that if we're going to do that, we have to determine how we make those choices. And we have to have what I call a consistent hermeneutic. It's a big word we use in seminary, but it's not that big after all. A hermeneutic is your interpretive framework. And it must be applied to all texts consistently. So my friend who said everything was literal, but didn't sell everything she had and gave it to the poor, I think she had a hermeneutic. And it went like this: anything that doesn't step on my own toes is literal, and anything that steps on my toes is not literal. Well, that's one hermeneutic. I also want folks to recognize our reading location. I, as a woman in the 21st century in the United States, Anglo, heterosexual, cisgendered, youngest of 3 daughters, child-free woman, will read the text a particular way that the next person may not. So that's part of that hermeneutic. And so when I'm presenting, I want my audience to know how I name my hermeneutic. As one who seeks to follow the ways of Jesus, I look to what we have in the Gospels as records of his teachings. And we know that at one point in a couple of places, Jesus is asked, what are the greatest commandments? And you may know what he said. The first one was, love God with all your heart, mind, being, strength. In Hebrew, I like to just say, love God with all you are. Which, by the way, he didn't make up. It came from Deuteronomy 6:5. And the second one is, love your neighbor as yourself, which comes from all places, Leviticus 19. Notice how we pick out those Leviticus passages. So when I come across texts that, like go and kill all the Canaanites, that don't help me love God with all I am and love my neighbor as myself, I don't get to throw them out like Thomas Jefferson. I actually have to work hard to figure out why were these texts left in the Bible. Could this be a story that's not go and do likewise, but rather a story of learn from our mistake? And when I come across a text that, does help me love God with all I am and my neighbor as myself, and, something like love is patient and kind, or later on in Leviticus when it says, love your enemy, I don't get to just say that's good and walk away. I have to work even harder in my interpretation to make certain I'm not making it say something that it can't say. So it's a hard idea of reading the Bible, interpreting the Bible. It's something that I do as a spiritual discipline, translating and working on interpreting texts. So enough about me. We'll get to the topic that everybody came for, sex, right? We're all here to talk about sex. It's something I do a lot in the Hebrew Bible. So we'll start there. There's some misconceptions among Christians about sex in the Hebrew Bible. It is not inherently bad, no matter what Augustine may have said, but rather human sexuality is a God-given blessing when shared between two consenting adults. If you think about it, the first command recorded in the Bible that the Holy gave to humans was, be fruitful and multiply. And to have fruits and multiply, you have to have sex. It's about companionship. It has the potential to be a sacred act. Look at Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. It's this wonderful love poetry that celebrates human love and sexuality. But like many gifts, sexuality also has the potential to be harmful when used to abuse another person. All right, in the ancient Near East, where the Hebrew Bible stories were developed and later written down and recorded, we need to look at why and how they tried to focus on procreation. First off, Israel was never a large population in the ancient Near East. Even at their peak, they couldn't have rivaled the Assyrians or the Babylonians. And so the survival of the people of Israel was a primary concern. Life was precarious. A famine, a disease, a war could literally wipe them all out. So they had to focus on survival. For women, pregnancy and childbirth were extremely dangerous. Many women died in childbirth. Some say the average age of a woman in that time was about 30, and for men, maybe 40. Now, those who didn't give birth lived longer. Like, look at Sarah, how old she was, and she didn't have children for a long time because that was a primary risk for women's safety. But they had to reproduce because it was how they kept the people going. I point out that we today are not on the verge of extinction due to underpopulation. Good, important fact when you're going from the ancient text to the 21st century. Also, infant mortality was very high. In some averages, about 90 to 95% of infants born at that time didn't make it past the age of 3. So again, everything was about trying to repopulate the people of Israel. Now, also, we need to think about Israel's understandings of reproduction. They were an agriculturally based community, intensive agriculture early on, where they grew, made, and raised everything they needed to survive. So in that agricultural context, their idea of procreation was based on seed and field. The male seed, they believed, had everything in it to produce a child. And the woman was the field that received the seed. Now, if the seed is planted, it takes root, grows into a baby, and it's a male child, which is what they really wanted, guess who got the credit? The man. If the seed is planted, grew into a child, and a daughter was born, guess who got blamed? The woman, even though we know that's not how reproduction works. And when a woman couldn't produce, she was called barren, which is a very agricultural term. So for them, the seed had to be protected and always needed to have the potential to plant and grow a new child. If you're not convinced about how important that seed was, spilling seed was usually highly prohibited because all seed that was spilled had to go towards reproduction. Now, there's several places you can see this, but one of my favorite stories is in Genesis 38, where Judah had a daughter-in-law, Tamar, and she married one of Judah's sons, and he died unexpectedly. And so his brother had to marry Tamar, and he, we read in the text, recognized that by marrying his brother's widow, the son they would produce would actually supplant him because it would be considered that deceased brother's child and would keep him from getting the full inheritance. So Onan was this guy's name, decided he wasn't going to let that hope happen. And so when they were supposed to consummate their marriage, he spilled the seed on the ground, and God struck him dead on the spot. Now there's a lesson. Again, because of that value placed on reproduction. So the Hebrew Bible and homosexuality it's important to start with the fact that there's no word in Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic, the languages of the Bible, for homosexuality. In fact, it didn't enter the English language until the 19th century. So that means if you're reading a Bible and it uses homosexuality, I would check out who did the translation and what they were basing it on. Biblical writers either assumed everyone was heterosexual, or more likely, in my opinion, they were just concerned with seed. And they certainly didn't have the same concepts of gender and sexuality that we have today in the 21st century. In fact, that seed is so important that lesbianism is not prohibited. Good news for lesbians, right? Who knew the Bible could do that? We do know, though, in history of different types of same-sex acts. We know that in the ancient world, a conquered army would often be raped by the victorious army. That wasn't about sexual orientation or even sexual desire. It was about debasing the one who was conquered because he'd have to play the part of a female. And that was a pretty big insult in that culture. We also know that some fertility cults used ritual sexual acts. And remember, Israel was not to follow their ways. And we know particularly in Greco-Roman contexts of a practice where an older male would keep a young boy for his sexual enjoyment. It was called pederasty, which we know today as pedophilia. But none of these are about consenting, loving relationships between two people that help them be the best they can be as reflections of the divine. If that's the case, then why do we have all these clobber passages? Well, there are not that many of them, really, when you stop and think about the whole Bible. But let's go to one of the places that often folks start. Have you ever seen that sign? God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? It might rhyme, but it's terrible, terrible biblical interpretation. Because the two creation stories in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2 are trying to talk about how the whole world came to be. So in Genesis 1, when God creates humankind in God's image, and it says male and female, God created them, that's biology. And if we're going to fill the world, you have to have a male and female, at least as far as the ancient Israelites knew. They didn't have any other way to get offspring. The second story in Genesis 2, though, is even more powerful, I think, to help us get rid of the binary stuff that we so often throw around in our world. In the second story, you may remember that God created this first being. It was called Adam, which is not a proper name. God created Adam from the Adamah, which is a pun. And Adamah means dirt or earth. So really, if we wanted to get that kind of pun, we'd say God created the earthling from the earth. Or God created the groundling from the ground. Or guess what? God created the human from the humus. We do it. Not hummus, humus. And that first creature, believe it or not, is never identified as male or female in the first part of the story. It's an it. It's a human being. And later, when the divine says, I got to find a fitting partner and the animals aren't going to work, the Holy puts that being to sleep and splits it down the middle. It says rib, but it really means side. So don't count your ribs and try and figure out if men have one less than we do. That's not where it comes from. And closed up the two sides, and then we finally have Ish, man, and Isha, woman. So a couple of things going on there. One, God didn't create man first and woman was a second thought, but rather God created the human that later became two. And again, we're talking about reproductive possibility, but that human creature that was neither male nor female or maybe something else really caught the imaginations of rabbis. They were trying to figure out what was going on. So one said that first creature, Adam, was androgynous and therefore wasn't distinguishable until there were two. And then you had male and female. Another rabbi said that when the Holy One created that first Adam, they were created as a back-to-back, two-sided figure. And so when they were in that position, they thought they were all alone. And God separated them so they could turn around and no longer be lonely. And so really what this story is saying is we are blessed to find someone who completes us. Now, I know Tom Cruise in a movie got that complete us stuff in our head long ago. But really, it doesn't matter who, what, how that configuration works. We are not meant to be alone, but to find someone who helps us be who God created us to be. So I just think that the rabbis were way ahead of us on this topic. And when we have conversations about transgender or non-binary, all we have to do is go back to Adam. And remember, that's how God created that first human. Really, that's it. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, is really a bad thing. But the next text, as I said, was the one who got me started on this path, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, one problem we have is people read Genesis 19 in isolation. But you have to read at least Genesis 18 to figure out the story. Because remember, Genesis 18 is when Abraham and Sarah entertain those three divine guests. And after they have fed them, given them shelter and water, they leave because God is sending someone to go down and hear whether all the bad stuff God's been hearing about Sodom and Gomorrah is true. Notice God won't take hearsay. God needs witnesses to know what's true. And so 2 of those guests go down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and one is left standing there that suddenly transforms into God. And Abraham and God have this conversation in which God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy those cities because they're wicked. And Abraham, you may remember, bargains with God. Will you destroy that city if there are this many innocent people? Surely, God, you wouldn't do that. And God says, no, if there's that many innocent, I won't destroy the city. And that bargaining goes on until God says, if there are only 10 righteous people in the city, I will save it. And that's where we move to Genesis 19. I mentioned in my sermon the importance of hospitality in the ancient Near East. Abraham and Sarah are examples of hospitality, as is Lot. Now, he's not the best father in the world, as the story turns out, but he is a host. Notice he doesn't wait inside his house for someone to come. He's out in the city gates looking for someone who might need shelter. So we turn to Genesis 19, and the story says that the angels came to Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city, and when he saw them, he said, come to my house. It's not safe to stay in the city square. Now remember, at one point, Lot was a stranger in this city. He probably knows what they do to strangers, and that's why he's out there offering hospitality. So they do come to his house, and after he's given them food and drink, they're about to go to bed. The NRSV reads, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house and called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out so we may know them. Now, here's the image that gets painted. All the men of Sodom are at Lot's door, and they want to know the male guests. And I think that's somewhere how people finally started seeing this as something other than a story about inhospitality. And, this is when Lot messes up and he says, no, but here are my 2 virgin daughters. Just take them instead. Not going to be father of the year. But again, remember, he was responsible for the safety of his guests. And unfortunately, in that culture, they were more valuable than the daughters. So Lot and his family are saved, and Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed. But look at what happened when I went back and translated Genesis 19 from the Hebrew. Verse 4, at evening they lay down, when the people of the city, the people of Sodom, from the youngest to the eldest, all the people of Sodom to the last one, surrounded the house. Get a different image? It's now the whole city, young and old, male and female, saying, bring out these strangers so we can abuse them. That one verse, if it had been translated a little bit more carefully, could, I think, maybe change a few things in the history of interpreting this text. So again, what is going on? These are outsiders, and Sodom doesn't handle outsiders with hospitality, but rather they want to know them. And I truly do think this is about sexual knowledge, but again, it's gang rape. Everybody would see that as a problem, as a grave sin. And why is it important that it's all the people, not just the men? How many righteous people did God need to save the city? 10. So if just the men came to the house, the women and children would certainly be innocent. And if God destroyed the city, then God didn't keep that promise. But the storytellers want us to know that there aren't 10 righteous people in the city. There's only Lot, his wife, and his daughters. That's why the story makes sense. It's not men wanting to have sex with men. It's a gang wanting to rape strangers because we don't like strangers. And they even try to get Lot, too, because he came as a stranger. The even more convincing part that this story is not about homosexuality is when we look at all the different places that Sodom and Gomorrah show up in the rest of the Bible. When they show up, the sins that are named include things like greed, abusive behavior, certainly gang rape would fit that category, idolatry, and inhospitality. Nothing about sex at all. And we know Jesus used Sodom and Gomorrah as the epitome of inhospitality when he told his disciples when they went out that if a city doesn't welcome you, shake the dust from your sandals, for it will be better in the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah than for that city. And you know, for centuries, millennia maybe, but certainly centuries, this story was not named as a story about homosexuality. The earliest reference I can find, and everybody says I blame Augustine for everything, but I'm right on this one. He's the first one that said that this was about men wanting to have sex with men. That's the story. And somewhere along the line, it became the story of homosexuality. Maybe because we don't want to read a story about a town that gets destroyed because it won't welcome strangers. That might step on our toes. The next text comes from Leviticus, and I just want you to put these in context. In the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, there are 613 commandments. 613. And these were only meant for Israel. They were to show Israel how to live in right relationship with God, neighbor, and self. And the first thing we need to know is it was meant to make Israel be different from their neighbors, so they would be identified by the God they worshiped. And it wasn't a buffet of laws. You couldn't walk up and say, I'll keep 6, 10, 225, 555, and 612, but the rest I'm going to let go of. It was all or nothing, people. And somehow, Christians, who I think somebody named Paul said we're no longer bound to those 613 commandments, want to keep 2. We do know, though, and I like to remind folks, these really weren't written in stone. Laws could be changed. In fact, in Numbers 27, we see an inheritance law being changed when we read about the daughters of Zelophehad, so that daughters could inherit land from their father if they had no brothers. And the Jewish tradition has a long history of reinterpreting these commandments for changing times and changing understandings of life and science. Somehow Christians, though, just don't want to let them move or change. The book of Leviticus, then, is where we find these 2. It actually comes from the Greek name for the book, the Levitical book. In Hebrew, it's named for the first word that appears, Vayikra, and God called to Moses. The rabbinic name was Torat Kohanim, which means either the instruction for the priests or the instructions of the priests. So it has a dual focus. There's a concern for how the priests were to officiate in the sanctuary, as well as a concern for how we are to live lives of wholeness, or how Israel was. Just a couple of things. It deals almost exclusively with religious practice, only 2 brief narratives in the mix. It has some unity to it, though sometimes it defies my logic. And the first 16 chapters are addressed to the priests. The last set are addressed to the whole people. The texts we look at are part of what is called the Holiness Code from Leviticus 17 to 26. And it requires these things. Now remember, it's not an if I'll take these buffet law code. It says that a child should be killed if they curse their parents. I don't know about you, but I would not be standing here today if we kept that commandment. Anyone guilty of adultery should be killed. I have a feeling Hollywood would be less populated, and maybe DC, and maybe some places we know, if we kept that as a literal commandment. A daughter of a priest who engages in prostitution must be killed. And anyone who says the Lord's name in vain must be killed, which is really about attaching God's name to something God wouldn't want to be a part of, like a war, or sometimes I think even a sporting event. I know, that was a dangerous move too far. The Holiness Code also prohibits a lot of things, like heterosexual intercourse with a menstruating woman, harvesting the corners of your field. Remember, that was like the first food bank. I don't think Big Agro would like to do that, to have to leave it behind for those who are most vulnerable in society. Crossbreeding livestock. Now, I'm a city girl. I had no idea what this meant, but I think a mule is the cross of a horse and a donkey, perhaps. You can't do that. Eating fruit from a young tree, and tattoos. This always gets people. You know, like if you have a tattoo, you've broken a commandment. And what I really love is when students come up to me and say, I want a tattoo in Hebrew. Now, I remind myself that they are not held to these 613 commandments, and I will help them out because it'd be better for them to have a Hebrew tattoo that was correct than some I've seen that were not. It also prohibits charging interest on a loan. I wish my mortgage company would have thought about that. So here are those two commandments in 18:22 and Leviticus 20, verse 13. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Here's a more wooden translation. With a male, you, and this is a masculine singular you, shall not lie the lying of a woman. It is an abomination. And the second, if a man lies with a male the lying of a woman, the two have done an abomination and shall be put to death. Now, why is that important? Well, first thing, these two commandments are about seed. Don't waste seed. And as I said, that's one reason why they don't worry about lesbians, because no seed's being wasted. And the other thing, that lying of the woman, is because if two men are having sex, one of them has to be the passive partner, and that's the partner who's usually a woman, and that would make a man look like a woman. And in that ancient world, again, that was a terrible insult. I think most of the time we've come a long way from that sexism. And then I hear a politician speak, and I find out maybe not. And one last thing, that word abomination, everybody thinks that's the worst sin ever. I had this minister at this silent prayer vigil. When we met with him before the vigil, he called my friend who's a lesbian, "You are an abomination." That's showing love, right? Well, let's look at abomination is the Hebrew word toivah. It usually is about something that brings ritual impurity, or perhaps something that transforms us into an extraordinary state. So it's not always that bad. And just if we think that abomination is God's top number one worst sin, let's look at a couple other things that are called an abomination. Eating a sacrifice at the wrong time. Eating pork or shellfish. This is why I just couldn't do this, because I love my bacon, and I really love scallops wrapped in bacon or shrimp, so again. Seeing a menstruating woman naked is an abomination. Also, eating with an Egyptian was seen as an abomination. So you can't mark that as the worst sin. It just doesn't work. All right, now we move to the New Testament. Sex in the New Testament, not nearly as much or as good as there is in the Hebrew Bible. If you want kids to read the Bible, show them Song of Songs, then close the Bible and let them try and find it. And they'll read other things all around it. I also like to say, Song of Songs says God is involved in the sexual behavior that we exhibit. That might be better than just don't do it. Say, God's in that back seat. Just remember that. God is always watching. Just a side note for if you have those interests of how to help folks be healthy in their sexuality. Sex in the New Testament. Well, when the New Testament was being written and brought together, this Jesus movement was actually a small minority religion. It didn't have any established reputation yet. And one of the greatest threats to that new movement came from Greco-Roman culture, especially the religions and this fear of assimilation by those who had committed to the way of Jesus. So to prove their legitimacy and to carve out their identity, early leaders of the movement like Paul tried to emphasize the sins of those Greco-Roman religions, especially those that might have incorporated sexual behavior in worship. Anything that even closely resembled the Greco-Roman behavior, like temple prostitutes, fertility rituals, was strictly prohibited for the new followers of the way. So we move to one of only a handful of texts in the New Testament, Romans 1, 26 to 27. Now, I just gave you those verses, but again, we have to read the whole thing. Paul is talking about what happens when you follow false idols. And it says, for this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion. Men committed shameless acts, etc. It also goes on to talk about some other things that happened that we conveniently leave out. That word natural, by the way, and unnatural, is the Greek phrase paraphizin. And it really means unconventional because Paul uses that same word in 1 Corinthians 11:14 in talking about men having long hair is unnatural. Exact same word. We think perhaps an image being provoked here in Romans is perhaps an orgy, something that the Greco-Roman culture might have embraced, and that was pagan. These people, as I said, are guilty of idolatry, and it goes on to say other things like envy and gossip is what happens. Those are the ones we leave out. And I think this text may be referring to heterosexual married couples. And so this behavior is going against their sexual identity or orientation. Imagine then how that applies when people try to force those who identify in the LGBTQIA+ community to go against their natural orientation. It turns it upside down when we think of it that way. Then we have two sin inventories about who is not going to get into the kingdom of God. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10, 1 Timothy 1, 1 to 10, they're pretty much the same. Do not be deceived, fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. And 1 Timothy says, the godless, the sinful, the unholy, the profane, who kill their father or mother, murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching will keep you out of the kingdom of God. Well, let's look at this. You notice I italicized a couple of words, in particular, sodomites. The word in Greek is arsenokoitai. Doesn't even sound like Sodom, right? It certainly wasn't a word sodomite in the ancient Greek language. But when people started translating that text, they started slipping in sodomites, even though it wasn't accurate at all. And even the NRSV, which is often considered the best of translations, at least when I was out of seminary, could have used arsenokoitai, which we think means something around male prostitutes, because the two words are male and bed. But even the NRSV that was done by an ecumenical interfaith group of translators used sodomite in these two texts. The RSV, which came before, and even the King James Version, used things like sexual perverts. And the other part I italicized is the word male prostitutes, which is the Greek word malakoi, which means soft or lazy. Think about that. We don't want lazy in that list, because I don't know about you, but I'm often very lazy. Or sometimes it can mean weak. Again, those sexist ideas about females. So what happened in the NRSV? Well, I have it from a reliable source that it was a give and take among the members of the committee. They knew arsenokoitai did not mean sodomite, but there was some sort of, we'll give you this if you'll give us something else. I don't know what that something else was. I've been told it was worth it, but I don't know. My experience is the harm and the violence because of that word being used. I can't think of anything that would be worth that trade. But just know the text doesn't say homosexual or sodomite. And the last one in the New Testament is in Jude. And if you don't know, Jude only has one chapter, so that's why it just says Jude 7. And it's a reference to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And it says they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, serving as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. That's not what the text says. It wasn't eternal fire. It was just a splash fire and you're gone and it's done. But New Testament likes that eternal fire stuff. So, sexual immorality. The people who were getting this text of Jude knew the story of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah about the gang rape, attempted gang rape. And that unnatural lust, remember the story is about divine beings and humans wanting to have sex with divine beings, which in that ancient mindset was a bad thing to do. Remember, that was part of the reason for the flood. So that's it, folks. That's all there is. I have a couple other slides, but I would rather stop and see if you have questions or comments. The whole slide I will make available again. You can do that with the handout. I have a little bit about some sex-friendly texts, and I will be happy to share all that. But I really want to let you talk because I've been talking a while. I don't know how long, but it seems like a while. According to this, 82 minutes, but this was on long before I stood up to talk. So, what would you like to ask? What would you like to say? Yes, sir.
Is there a translation that more accurately, reflects the true nature of these scriptures?
So there is an updated NRSV. And I do know in the Corinthians and Timothy passage, they've removed the word sodomite or homosexual. So that's a little better. But when I went to Genesis 19, they still had it as men. And the Hebrew phrase there that I think says it has to be all the people, in addition to Genesis 18's ending, is this phrase, kol ha'am, which means all the people or all the nation. Am is never used to describe only men. It's the whole people. And that updated version did not fix that, in my opinion. I'm not certain exactly I can't remember what they did with the Leviticus text. But again, as Christians, if we're not going to follow all of them, then We don't have to follow any of them, and we certainly shouldn't be choosing to. Remember, love your neighbor as yourself? It occurs in Leviticus 19. 18 is that first text, 20 is the next, and right between them is love your neighbor as yourself. I'm like, when Jesus went to pick out that second greatest commandment, if homosexuality was God's top 10 worry, he would have chosen one of those. But he dove right into the middle, like many Jewish rabbis before him, and said the whole of Torah is love God with all you are and love your neighbor as yourself. And you may have noticed that I went all through this and not a single gospel text. Jesus didn't say anything about this. He said a few things about greed and lying and not welcoming people. But again, maybe we need to spend a little more time in the Hebrew Bible and read Ruth and Naomi's story or David and Jonathan's story, and a little more time in the Gospels, and let Paul's letters be what they were, correspondence that I'm sure he never thought we'd be reading today and basing our religion on it. I don't have anything against Paul. I have a lot against people who make him the primary sign. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, sir.
How did you lecture go over on the military base?
So it was a Zoom lecture with, the base was in Idaho, Air Force Base. Now, Idaho is not your most progressive state. The Air Force Base there is doing a lot to welcome and to work with those who have children who are transitioning or soldiers, because the culture of Idaho is not welcoming of that. And I have a student who's the chaplain there. So he set this all up. And I went through my presentation, and, I'm seeing this much of the room, and a lot of nodding heads and a lot of good things. And then when I asked for questions, the first person stood up and said, "Your interpretation's just wrong."
Was it a male?
Yes. Of a certain age. And he went on to try and debate with me. And I tried that whole, so why would you take that literally and not this or this or this? And he could never answer me. And so finally he shut up for a while. I find if I keep talking and trot out some Hebrew and Greek, I can usually get them to think a little more carefully. But then there was a woman who's the Jewish representative to the religious community at that Air Force Base who spoke and said, "Oh my gosh, that's exactly what we Jews like to say." And, it gave me a lot of affirmation. And she was the one that reminded us all that those commandments aren't set in stone, that Jewish people have been reinterpreting them over and over again, and most of the more Reformed and Reconstructionist Jewish community don't follow them like that anymore. So it was okay. I don't think I got my student in trouble. I wished I could have been there in person. I think it's a lot more engaged if I can look at someone and stand close to them and have this conversation. But I don't think I changed his mind either.
When I was in the Air Force, we went out on the weekend for basic training and came back, and a couple of guys were having a lot of fun. How do you think that would have varied and changed anything at all? It would have been livestock or whatever.
Yeah.
We never saw them.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I'd have to ponder that. But I tell people you can believe whatever you want, but if you want to talk about the biblical text, we're going to have some ground rules about how we interpret texts. Yes.
One thing that kept coming to me when you were talking through this, and I want to see if I'm understanding this correctly. When it talked about, I think you had said that man laying with a man was like because you don't want to be the lady part. Like for me, I don't hear homosexual sex. I hear domination.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that's something in 2023, 22, whatever.
I was scared for a moment. I lost a whole year.
Like
Yeah.
But I think that we totally forget, and the last person we had come and speak in this church about this, that was the message I kept hearing is, then the social structure was completely different. Completely different. And so what I'm hearing now from my current interpretation is it's about dominating. And I think that if we look at it through that lens, it completely changes the conversation.
Yeah, it does. And that's why I say very clearly, they're not talking about the relationships and the understandings of gender identity and sexual orientation that we have
About
today.
transfer of power.
Yes, yes.
What she said about how the king, what happens after he wins the battle to the
Yeah, that's right. It's domination, making you feel humbled, which again, interesting, I think, is that in Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible Hebrew, there's no word for rape. And I heard a woman on TV one time who was from a culture that I think spoke Arabic, maybe. I can't remember the specific language, but she said, we have no word for rape. And when you don't have a word for rape in your vocabulary, then it can't happen. And I think some of what we see in the Hebrew Bible, again, if they had had a word for rape, it would have been used, perhaps. But certainly, domination is a part of it. Denying people the ability to be who God created them to be is, there's nowhere in the Bible, I think, that we can walk away and say that's the dominant message. If anything, it's the exact opposite. And I think the person you had come, Warren Carter, is now my colleague at Phillips. We stole him from Bright. And actually, I went and told him I was coming, and he was like, oh, yes, I remember that. And I can't do his accent, by the way, but I love it. And he also said, I remember they had a community garden. I hope they still have that. So I'll be happy to go back and tell him, yes, you do. So, yeah, Warren's one of my dear colleagues. Other questions, comments? Yes?
I've heard another interpretation of that same scripture in Leviticus where it's sort of sandwiched in a bunch of adultery clauses. And one person I know reading it as thou shalt not, or, you know, in the King James speak or whatever, but don't take a man in your marriage bed,
Yeah.
suggesting that if you're a married man and you cheat on your wife with a man, it's just as bad as cheating on your wife with another woman. Is there any credence to that? Have you found anything like that in your reading of the Hebrew?
The Hebrew doesn't allow that, in my opinion. It's pretty, as I woodenly said, do not lie the lying of a woman with a man. There's no mention of marriage, which is also not a big deal because other people don't know there's no word for marriage in Hebrew. And there's no separate word for wife and husband. It's woman and man, isha and ish. So every time you read woman and husband in the Hebrew Bible, it's really like her man or his woman. And to symbolize marriage, they use words like lakach, which means to take, like property, or natan, the father gives the daughter, which is another property piece, because daughters were property. So I don't find that in the Hebrew. Contextual clues around it might work, but to me, I often want to do the text justice and not do gymnastics to make it fit what I want it to say. And sometimes I think even the best intentioned folks will go to do those gymnastics. And if I have to do that, then I'm just going to say, well, this text doesn't help me love my neighbor as myself or God with all I am. And so why the heck is it there? And that's why I was talking about, fertility and male dominance, etc. I just try to let the text, I tell folks, there's no one interpretation of a passage, but that doesn't mean every interpretation is valid. And my students say, well, Dr. D, how do you know the difference? And I say, well, one guideline for me is if the interpretation claims something for the text that the words in Hebrew or Greek won't let it say, then that's not a valid interpretation, be it something I think is greatly progressive or something that I take as terribly fundamentalist. Yes, ma'am.
How would you interpret one of the more predominant quotes these days? Love the sinner, hate the sin. Thank you.
First off, I would say, and I hear this a lot, again, with some folks who believe they're being progressive, will say, well, we're all sinners. Well, there's a problem there. Loving someone and being who you are and loving and helping them be who they are, that's not a sin. And so loving the sinner and hating the sin, that's everybody if we want to say we're all sinful. But when it applies to something like sexual orientation and gender identity, those aren't inherently sins. At least I can't find any evidence for that. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was asking. I just know I've had to deal with that situation with stupid high school boys who I don't even know this conversation came up, but they were saying really mean things about people in the LGBT, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And I myself have a lot of friends in that community, and not that I want to go on, but he was arguing. I was trying to explain he himself says he's a avid follower of Christ and he's very deep in the religion, and I'm like, then why aren't you loving your neighbor?
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like, hate the sin, not the sinner. After, of course, he went off pride about how upset that he was that I opposed him. Love that for me. But he was just so stubborn in that, and I know it's not important to argue it because he won't really change his mind just knowing his background, but how do you come to terms with that, just knowing that like one of your closest friends is going to go off and still be mean to the people you care about? And it's not, it's hard to stop being friends with him because I care about him, but also it's like, I don't know what to do in that situation.
Yeah. I'm really glad you challenged him, and you should. But I think all of us have to realize there's some people that it's not the right moment. It's not their teachable moment. And we can love, at that point, you can love the sinner and hate the sin. It's all good. But seriously, I like I said, there are some people that I've encountered, like the guy on the military base, that I could not change his mind at that point in time. And I had to say, okay, we'll agree to disagree. But please know that you're not adequately interpreting Scripture. Now, I know a high school kid may not find that convincing, but again, thank you for standing up for your friends. And if you'd like, get that handout and give it to your friend.
Yeah.
And I may, as I have in the past, get an email from your friend, but that's okay. I've had those before. I forgot to mention when I did the letter to the editor, I got a letter at my seminary office, handwritten without a return address. And I opened it up, and it went through all this stuff, and it basically came down to 3 accusations. You must be a lesbian. You sound like Michael Kinnaman. And you're full of Satan. And I thought to myself, there's got to be an insult in there that they're intending, but, calling me a lesbian is not an insult. It come as a shock to my lifetime companion all these 33 years, but it is not an insult. Does everybody know who Michael Kinnaman is? No. He's a wonderful theologian. He taught at Lexington. He taught at Eden. He was once Upford general minister and president of the Disciples, but was voted out by a railroading of voters because he was part of what was then GLAAD. He is brilliant. When he was the dean at Lexington and I started teaching there, if he took me to lunch, I felt like I needed a dictionary just to understand. So calling me Michael Kinnaman was like, oh my gosh, I've made it in the world. And I don't have a belief in Satan. I just don't think that's how it works. So I might be filled with Satan, but so what? But literally, and I realized at that moment with all this fuss I was getting that I only got the briefest little glimpse of what my friends endure all their lives, every day. And I was like, it breaks my heart, and I know it breaks the Holy's heart to see those things. So some people would say, oh, we shouldn't have this conversation, it's over. Well, I hope someday I don't need to give this presentation, but as long as I am seeing what I'm seeing right now, I'm afraid it might be more necessary in the future than it has been. I don't know when we have to quit, so I'm good to take questions or to say that you're done. Okay, all right, thank you. Russ has my email. It's also on the Phillips webpage, but if you have further questions or comments, feel free to email me. I love to get those emails, and I usually answer them pretty quickly. Thank you all very much.
I only said it's time to stop because I know youth group had just finished. So I'm like, okay, Ryan, I care about you, and so we're going to go ahead and start wrapping up. The handouts are on that back table in the corner there. So pick one of those up. If you have someone I'm printed more than there are people here. So if there's someone you know that you think would appreciate having one of those, feel free to pick up an extra. And like I said, I'll put an electronic copy and the slides in this week's weekly church email. But thank you all for sticking around. Thanks for everybody with us on the live stream. And thank you, Lisa, for making the trip down and being with us. All right. Y'all have a good